The tropical heat of New Guinea lay thick as engine oil, pressing down on every sound and smell in the air. Inside the dim hangar, Captain Paul Irvin Gun wiped sweat and grime from his brow and stared at the monster he had created. Before him stood a B-25 Mitchell bomber, but not the kind that had rolled off any factory line. Its nose, once transparent and meant for navigation and bombsight precision, was now a snarling jaw of gleaming metal and menacing intent. 850 caliber machine guns jutted from it like the teeth of some mechanical beast. The smell of gun oil, hot metal, and tropical dust fused into an atmosphere thick with tension and possibility. Around him, a handful of mechanics stood frozen, their faces pale and glistening. A wrench slipped from one man's trembling hand and clattered onto the concrete floor, its sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. Everyone knew what they were looking at was forbidden. This was no authorized modification, no officially sanctioned design. It was an act of rebellion, one that could end Paul Gun's career or his freedom. In wartime, the line between heroism and insubordination could vanish faster than the vapor trail of a fighter over the Pacific. But for Gun, this was no act of defiance for pride's sake. It was desperation made tangible in steel and fire. Every bolt he tightened, every cable he rerouted, every barrel he installed had been driven by something more powerful than orders, grief. He looked at the aircraft with eyes that no longer saw machinery alone. He saw vengeance, necessity, and the faint, flickering chance of redemption. The hum of generators outside mixed with the calls of distant jungle birds. In the background, other crews worked on routine maintenance, blissfully unaware that inside this hangar, history was being rewritten in grease and brass. Gun SB-25, a Frankenstein creation now bristling with forward-firing power, stood ready to challenge the conventional wisdom of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Bombers were meant to drop ordnance from a distance, not attack like fighters. They were not designed to strafe enemy ships, airfields, or columns. What Gun had done violated doctrine, design, and direct orders. He ran his callous fingers over the polished barrels, feeling the heat they would soon unleash. The Forbidden's nose was his creation, his gamble. If this works, he murmured to himself, we will finally have something that hits back. Outside, the Pacific War had entered a brutal stage. Japanese forces had pushed deep into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Allied pilots were dying in the skies. Bombers sent to strike Japanese convoys were shredded by anti-aircraft fire before they could even drop their payloads. Morale was low, losses were high, and innovation, real, dangerous innovation, had been replaced by bureaucracy and fear of failure. Gun had seen too much death to wait for permission. His hands, stained with oil and guilt, had built something the rulebook said should not exist. But the rulebook was not bleeding in the jungles. The rulebook was not watching men die because their aircraft lacked teeth. The other officers who had seen his work whispered words like crazy and court-martial, but there were others, the younger pilots, the restless mechanics, the ones who had stared too long at the horizon and seen nothing but more funerals, who looked at the modified B-25 and saw hope. Gun took a deep breath as a jeep pulled up outside the hangar. The sound of its engine made every man inside stiffen. Out stepped a major, clipboard in hand, his uniform immaculate despite the heat. The man looked at the aircraft and froze, his jaw tightening as his eyes traced the barrels protruding from the bomber's nose. "Captain Gun," he said slowly, "what in God's name have you done to that airplane?" Gun did not flinch. He met the major's gaze, his expression calm, almost defiant. "I built something that can fight back," he replied. The major stepped closer, his boots echoing on the concrete. "You do realize this modification is unauthorized? You could be stripped of your rank for this?" Gun nodded. "I do, but if it saves lives out there, it will be worth it." There was a pause. The sound of a distant engine rumbled from the runway outside, followed by the crackle of radio chatter. The major walked around the nose, inspecting the craftsmanship. Crude, yes, but solid. The mounts were reinforced, the ammunition belts fed cleanly through improvised housings. It was madness, yet somehow it looked right. Have you tested it? The Major asked quietly. Gun hesitated for a moment, only on the ground. The air test will come next. Without authorization? Gun gave a faint, grim smile. Sir, the Japanese did not ask for authorization before they bombed us. The Major's eyes flicked to the aircraft again, then back to Gun. He exhaled slowly, the moral weight of the situation pressing down on him. You are gambling with your career, Captain. Maybe even your life. Gun looked past him, through the open hangar doors toward the distant green jungle where the war raged unseen. Then it is a gamble worth taking, he said. Later that evening, as the tropical sun dipped below the horizon and the hangar lights cast long, sharp shadows across the floor, Gun sat on a wooden crate. The grief that followed had hollowed him out. But it had also lit a fire that refused to die. Every act of creation since that moment had been his answer to the void left behind. The forbidden snows, the illegal guns, they were not just weapons. They were his defiance against loss, against helplessness. The next morning, the bomber taxied out to the runway for its first test flight. The crew climbed aboard, tense and silent. Gun took the co-pilot seat, his eyes scanning the instrument panel, his heart pounding like the engines that roared to life beside him. The aircraft lifted into the humid air, heavy with expectation. Over the jungle, they spotted a derelict barge near the coast, the perfect target. Gun gripped the trigger, the 8 guns erupted in unison, the sound deafening, the vibration shaking the entire frame of the plane. The air filled with the smell of cordite and the flash of tracer fire. Below, the barge was ripped apart in seconds, flames and splinters erupting from the impact zone. When the bomber landed, the ground crew ran to meet it. The fuselage was intact, the guns had worked flawlessly. The air was thick with disbelief and awe. The Forbidden's design had just proven itself in the most undeniable way possible. Gun stepped down from the aircraft, his boots hitting the tarmac with finality. He looked back at the plane, the smoking barrels cooling in the tropical breeze, and whispered under his breath, "Now they will have to see." He knew the fight ahead was not just in the skies, but in the corridors of military power, a battle of ideas, authority, and survival. The Forbidden's nose had just taken its first bite out of history, and there was no turning back. Before Captain Paul Irvin Gun ever stood in that sweltering hangar in New Guinea, before the smell of gun oil and the roar of engines became the rhythm of his days, there was another life. A life that now seemed like it belonged to someone else. The year was 1941, and the world was teetering on the edge of chaos. In the quiet moments before dawn on December 8th, Paul Gun's world shattered. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor rippled across the Pacific like a shockwave, reaching far beyond Hawaii's burning ships. In the Philippines, where Gun's family lived, the nightmare was only beginning. At the time, Captain Gun was serving as a pilot and maintenance officer stationed in Australia, supporting Allied operations as the threat of war grew ever closer. He had sent his wife, Clara, and their 2 young children, Emma and Thomas, to Manila months earlier, believing they would be safer there than in the uncertain front lines of the Pacific. That decision would become the wound that never healed. When the Japanese forces invaded the Philippines just hours after Pearl Harbor, chaos consumed the islands. Manila fell under attack and communications with the region broke down almost immediately. Gun tried to send word, desperate for any confirmation that his family had escaped. Weeks passed with no reply, then months. Each unanswered message felt like another nail sealing the coffin of hope. The official telegram that arrived in February was cold and bureaucratic. It stated simply that his family's whereabouts were unknown, that Manila had fallen, and that many civilians were believed to be held in internment camps. There was no mention of names, no assurances, only a blank space where certainty should have been. From that moment, something inside Paul Gun began to change. His colleagues noticed it first in his silence. The once affable, sharp-minded aviator became a man consumed by purpose. He took every assignment that came his way, flying reconnaissance missions in dangerous zones, repairing damaged aircraft with his own hands, and volunteering for missions others avoided. His workbench became his refuge, his cockpit his confessional. In the small hours of the morning, when most of the base slept, Gun could be found under the dim glow of a work lamp, sketching designs on scraps of paper, his mind racing with ideas that stretched far beyond regulations. He believed that the war was being fought with outdated thinking and that innovation was being strangled by red tape. But the root of his obsession was not strategy, it was grief disguised as ingenuity. He had seen firsthand how Allied bombers, particularly the B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs, were being torn apart during low-level attacks. Their nose-mounted defenses were weak, their offensive power limited to bombs that often missed fast-moving naval targets. Pilots were dying before they could even release their payloads. Gun could not stand by and watch it happen. Every plane that went down, every crew that vanished in smoke and ocean spray, felt like another echo of his family's disappearance. He began to tinker in secret, using scavenged parts from wrecked aircraft. He experimented with different mounting systems, trying to increase the firepower on the forward fuselage. It started with drawings, then mock-ups, then late-night modifications when the hangar was empty. He tested airflow, recoil stability, and balance. Every success, however small, fueled his determination. Every failure fed his anger. He remembered the early days of his aviation career, back in the 1930s, when flight still felt like freedom, when the airfield was a place of wonder, not war. He had fallen in love with engines then, with the sound of pistons firing and the smell of fuel. He had believed, like so many young men of his generation, that flight could unite the world. But now, flight had become a weapon. By 1942, Gun's transformation was complete. His fellow officers no longer recognized the man they once called the professor for his calm intellect. Now they called him the mad tinkerer behind his back. He did not care. He was driven by something deeper than reputation. In the privacy of his quarters, he kept a single photograph of his family, Claire's smile, Emma's curls, Thomas's small hand clutching his father's sleeve. The photo was faded and creased from being held too often. It was both his torment and his fuel. That same year, the air war over the Pacific reached a brutal crescendo. Japanese convoys streamed through the islands, their ships heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns. Allied bombers that flew high risked missing their targets, while those that flew low were shredded by enemy fire. The standard tactics were failing and morale was slipping fast. It was during one of these disastrous missions that Gun's vision began to crystallize. A squadron of B-25s was sent to attack a Japanese supply convoy off New Britain. The formation was torn apart, only to aircraft made it back to base. When Gun walked among the returning planes, he saw the bullet holes, the shattered glass, the twisted metal. He helped pull wounded men from cockpits slick with blood and oil. That night, he could not sleep. He sat by the airstrip under the stars, the humid air heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and smoke. If we had been able to shoot forward, he muttered to himself, they might have lived. From that point on, his mind became a forge. He started calculating firing arcs, recoil dispersion, and fuselage stress loads. He studied the way fighters like the P-38 Lightning were armed and wondered why bombers could not do the same. To him, the solution was obvious: give the B-25 the ability to attack head-on, to strafe, to become a hybrid between bomber and gunship. But such an idea was heresy to the command structure. Bombers were meant to bomb, not to fight. Yet the rules that defined the war were written far away from the front lines, in offices untouched by the sound of gunfire. Gun's experience on the ground told him that survival depended not on adherence to doctrine, but on adaptability. He began to recruit a small team of like-minded mechanics and pilots, men who had seen enough death to question authority. They worked after hours, piecing together parts scavenged from downed aircraft, testing mounts and ammo feeds under the guise of routine maintenance. The base commander was suspicious, but too overwhelmed by the chaos of war to investigate closely. Gun's obsession bordered on self-destruction. He stopped writing home, even though no letters would have reached their destination. He barely ate, barely slept. The mechanics joked that he spoke more to his engines than to other people. Yet when his design began to take shape, a modified nose with multiple forward firing, 50 caliber guns, even the skeptics could not deny the ingenuity. Still, he was haunted every time he looked at his creation. He thought of his family. What would they think if they could see him now? Would Clara recognize the man who had become so consumed by vengeance that he had turned invention into an act of mourning? The grief that made him was also the force that blinded him to fear. The rules no longer mattered. He had lost too much to care about regulations written by men who had never bled for them. When his superiors finally discovered what he was building, the confrontation was inevitable. Yet by then, Gun had already crossed the point of no return. He was ready to face whatever consequences would come, because for him, the war had already taken everything that mattered. The morning light broke over the airfield in New Guinea, gilding the jungle's edge in a haze of gold and smoke. The heat rose early, shimmering above the tarmac as the modified B-25 Mitchell sat in full view for the first time. Its forward guns gleamed, their barrels extending from the solid nose like a challenge aimed directly at authority itself. Captain Paul Irvin Gun stood with his hands on his hips, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Around him, his small circle of mechanics moved quickly, tightening bolts, checking feed chutes, and running last-minute diagnostics before the test flight. They all knew what this meant. Today would prove whether their Forbidden's design was genius or madness. But before that flight, Gun had endured weeks of resistance. The discovery of his Frankenstein project had ignited outrage in the upper ranks. The engineering department had called it reckless. The operations officers had labeled it insubordination. The paperwork from the War Department explicitly stated that no unapproved field modifications could be made to standard aircraft designs without authorization from headquarters. Gun's project violated every clause of that order. When summoned before Colonel McAdams, his commanding officer, the air in the office had been as heavy as the silence that followed the first accusation. Captain Gun, McAdams began, "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you are in? You have modified government property. You have bypassed ordnance protocols. You have risked the lives of men and the reputation of this unit. Do you deny any of that?" Gun had stood at attention, his uniform still stained with engine grease. "No, sir, I do not deny it." "Then explain yourself," McAdams demanded. Gun took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, our bombers are dying out there. The Japanese convoys are tearing them apart before they can release their bombs. The B-25 is strong, but it is toothless in a head-on attack. I designed a solution. A forward gun package that will let us strafe, suppress, and destroy before the enemy can react. If we do not change, we will keep losing men for no reason." McAdams frowned. "Your job is not to change the war, Captain. Your job is to follow orders." Gun met his eyes without flinching. "Following orders will not win this war, sir." Thinking will, for a long moment, the colonel had said nothing, then he dismissed Gun with a curt nod. "You are grounded until further notice," he said, but Gun did not stay grounded. He continued his work under the pretense of performing maintenance checks. His team stayed loyal, driven by the same frustration and fear that fueled him. It was during this period of tension that Gun's path intersected with a man who would change everything, General George C. Kenney. The hard-nosed commander of the 5th Air Force, Kenney had arrived in the Pacific Theater determined to innovate, to adapt the air war to the unique conditions of the region. He valued results over rhetoric, and he had an instinct for recognizing practical genius when he saw it. When Kenney first heard rumors of a mad captain with a machine gun bomber, he was intrigued rather than furious. He ordered a demonstration. On that humid morning, Gun's team prepared the B-25 for its trial run. Kenney arrived flanked by aides, his uniform immaculate, his expression skeptical but curious. He observed the modified nose, ran his fingers along the barrels, and turned to Gun. "You did all this yourself?" he asked. With a small crew, sir, Gunn replied. It is not factory work, but it is solid. Kenny nodded slowly. And you believe this can make a difference? I do not believe it, sir, Gunn said. I know it. Kenny's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. Then show me. Moments later, the B-25 lifted into the sky once again. The general and his aides watched from the ground as the aircraft banked toward a derelict ship anchored off the coast, a rusted hulk used for training exercises. The modified bomber lined up for its run, and then, as it roared in low, the air erupted with the thunder of 8.50 caliber guns. Tracers streaked across the blue, tearing into the target in a storm of fire and smoke. The ship disintegrated under the barrage, its hull riddled with holes and flames licking through its deck. When the bomber returned and taxied to a stop, the ground crew and onlookers burst into cheers. Gunn climbed out of the cockpit, his face streaked with sweat, his expression unreadable. Gunn climbed out of the cockpit, his face streaked with sweat, his expression unreadable. Kenny walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped in front of him. Captain, he said, his voice calm but firm, you just proved what every regulation in Washington said was impossible. Gunn straightened. Does that mean I am under arrest, sir? Kenny's gaze hardened, then softened. No, Captain, he said finally. It means you are now in charge of modifying every B-25 we can get our hands on. Effective immediately, the tension broke like a wave. Gunn's men exchanged looks of disbelief. The Forbidden's design had become official policy. What had begun as a desperate act of grief had just been sanctioned by the highest authority in the theater. From that day forward, the hangars buzzed with new energy. Crews worked day and night retrofitting bombers with forward-firing guns. Machine shops rang with the sound of cutting metal and drilling mounts. Ammunition belts were laid out like veins feeding a living creature. Engineers debated designs, refining what Gunn had started. The planes were nicknamed gunships, a term that would later define an entire class of aircraft. But success came with its own weight. Gunn found himself both celebrated and scrutinized. The same officers who had once called him reckless now called him a visionary, though not without resentment. Headquarters demanded documentation, blueprints, and test reports. Bureaucrats wanted to claim credit. Others wanted to limit his influence. He also faced a new moral unease. Every time he saw one of the modified planes roll out onto the runway, he knew what those guns were capable of. He had made them to save lives, but they were designed to kill more efficiently. He had turned grief into innovation, but that innovation was born from destruction. In one particularly quiet evening after a day of test flights, Gunn sat outside the hangar watching the sun sink into the jungle horizon. The air was filled with the faint thump of distant artillery and the drone of patrol aircraft. He thought about his family again, about whether they were still alive, somewhere in a camp or a grave he would never see. He wondered if they would understand what he had done, if they would forgive him for the obsession that had consumed him. Word of his design spread quickly. The modified B-25s, now armed with multiple 50 caliber guns and sometimes even a 75mm cannon, became legends among pilots. They could strike low and hard, tearing through enemy convoys with devastating effect. The soldiers began to call them strafer bombers. For the first time, Allied airmen felt they could truly fight back on equal terms. For the first time, Allied airmen felt they could truly fight back on equal terms. Still, Gunn was not content. He continued refining the design, adjusting gun angles, reinforcing mounts, and experimenting with payload combinations. His makeshift engineering team became a symbol of field innovation, proof that the front lines could outthink the bureaucracy. But every victory carried a shadow. As the firepower increased, so did the danger to the crews. Low-level attacks meant flying into the teeth of enemy fire. Many aircraft never returned. Gunn attended more funerals than he could count. Each time he stood before another flag-draped coffin, he felt the conflict twist deeper inside him. He had built the means to fight back, but at what cost? Still, when the mission reports began to show the results, convoys destroyed, enemy bases neutralized, Allied forces gaining ground, even the skeptics in Washington took notice. The Forbidden's design had become a weapon of strategic importance. For Gun, however, the battle was no longer about recognition or vindication. It was about seeing his invention through, ensuring that the men who flew these machines had the best chance to come home alive. The stage was set. The modified B-25s were ready for their first full-scale operation. The tropical dawn broke like an explosion of gold over the Solomon Islands. The sea below glimmered deceptively calm, but beneath the sheen of peace lurked the machinery of war. Japanese convoys churned through the deep blue water, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns, their holds filled with supplies and soldiers destined to reinforce the front. Overhead, the droning thunder of engines grew louder. It was a new sound, heavier, angrier. The modified B-25 Mitchells were coming. Captain Paul Irvin Gun stood on the flight line at the Allied base, watching his creation take to the sky in formation. He was not flying that day. Instead, he stood with his headset pressed tight against his ears, his eyes tracking the rising silhouettes of the bombers he had helped transform. They no longer looked like the slender bombers of old, they looked like predators. Each nose bristled with guns, barrels gleaming in the rising sun. They were machines reborn for vengeance. They looked like predators, each nose bristled with guns, barrels gleaming in the rising sun. They were machines reborn for vengeance. The operation was simple in plan, brutal in execution. The Japanese convoy was to be hit in a coordinated low-level attack. The new gunship B-25s would come in first, strafing decks and anti-aircraft emplacements, clearing the way for follow-up bombers to drop their payloads. It was an audacious strategy, one that would have been unthinkable before Gun's modification. From the command tent, the radio crackled to life. The voices of the pilots came through, taut with focus. Target in sight, one reported, another added, flak heavy, but stable. Guns holding, Gun listened as the attack unfolded. He could picture every detail in his mind, the roar of engines, the vibration of metal under strain, the thunder of 50 caliber guns blazing in unison. The modified B-25s screamed down upon the convoy, their tracers cutting fiery arcs through the air. The first ships erupted in chaos, explosions tore through decks, gunners thrown from their stations as the aircraft swept by in a hail of bullets. Aboard one of the lead planes, Lieutenant Fred Thompson gritted his teeth as he pressed the trigger. The entire aircraft shuddered under the recoil, the sky filled with smoke and heat. "God Almighty," he yelled into his mic, "it is working." On the ground, Gun could hear the triumph in their voices. He felt it in his chest, that mixture of pride and fear that only creators know when they see their invention unleashed for the first time. But victory came at a cost. One bomber, strafing to low, took a direct hit from a ship's flak gun. The explosion tore through its right wing. It banked sharply, trailing fire, and plunged into the sea. It banked sharply, trailing fire, and plunged into the sea. Gun closed his eyes for a moment, the sound of the pilot's last transmission, static and silence, echoing in his headset. By the time the surviving bombers returned to base, the battle was over. The Japanese convoy was in ruins. Reports confirmed that several ships had been sunk outright, others left burning and crippled. Allied losses were minimal compared to previous missions. The base erupted in celebration. Mechanics cheered, officers slapped backs, and pilots shouted over the roar of returning engines. The impossible had become possible. Gun stood apart from the crowd, watching the planes taxi in. Gun stood apart from the crowd, watching the planes taxi in. Their noses were blackened with powder, their barrels still hot. The men climbed out exhausted, faces streaked with sweat and soot, eyes alight with the thrill of survival. One young pilot approached Gun, grinning like a boy. "Captain, it worked," he said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "Those bastards did not stand a chance." Gun nodded. "Good work, Lieutenant," but his eyes lingered on the horizon, where the smoke of the battle still rose in the distance like a dark bruise against the dawn. He knew the cost of innovation. Every improvement in war carried the shadow of destruction. He had given these men a fighting chance, but he had also given them a deadlier weapon. In the weeks that followed, guns modified B-25s became the spearhead of Allied air operations across the Pacific. They swept through WWII and the Bismarck Sea, shredding enemy convoys and turning the tide of the air war. The results were undeniable. Commanders who had once dismissed him now quoted his reports. His designs were requested by headquarters and replicated in field workshops across the theater. News spread fast. American newspapers back home began printing stories of the flying gunships of the Pacific. They spoke of ingenuity and courage, of the daring men who turned bombers into strafing beasts. They did not mention the grief that had driven it, nor the sleepless nights, nor the faces of the men who had died testing it. When General Kenny himself visited Gun's base again, he found the captain hunched over another blueprint, refining feed systems for sustained bursts. The general smiled. "You did it, Gun," he said. "You changed the war." Gun looked up, his eyes weary. "Yes, sir. But I sometimes wonder what had changed in me." Kenny's smile faded. "War changes us all, Captain. The question is whether we can live with what it makes us." Gun nodded slowly. He understood that truth too well. By 1943, the gunship concept had evolved further, leading to the creation of specialized attack aircraft. The A-20s and B-25s Gun had helped modify became legends. The tactic of low-level strafing runs reshaped how air power was used in the Pacific. Historians would later call it one of the most effective innovations of the theater, born not in laboratories or factories, but in a jungle hangar by a man who refused to obey the rules of defeat. And yet, long after the war, when victory celebrations faded and medals were pinned, Gun's legacy remained complicated. Some hailed him as a hero of invention. Others saw him as a symbol of the moral grayness that war inevitably breeds, a man who had turned grief into firepower, loss into lethal creativity. In his later years, those who met him described a quiet man who avoided the spotlight. He never sought fame, never published memoirs, never claimed his rightful place in the pantheon of wartime innovators. He returned to the airfields occasionally, walking among the aging planes like a father visiting the graves of his children. He would run a hand along the cold metal, eyes distant, as if listening to the echoes of engines that no longer roared. He kept one relic from the war, the wrench that had slipped from a mechanic's hand on that first day in the hangar, when the forbidden's nose had been revealed. To him, it was more than a tool. It was a reminder that creation and destruction often begin with the same spark, the decision to act when no one else will. When asked once why he did it, he simply said, "Because I could not do nothing." The ultimate war machine he built had saved countless lives and shortened countless battles. But the man behind it carried scars no metal could heal. The balance of war had shifted, yes, but so had the balance within him. His invention had proven that desperation could forge genius, but also that every act of creation in war leaves a shadow that lingers long after the guns fall silent. In the end, history remembered the weapon more than the man. Yet somewhere in that vast silence between innovation and consequence, the name Captain Paul Irvin Gun endures, not as a rebel, not as a savior, but as the embodiment of the truth that every victory comes at a cost too human to measure.